I wasn't really typical of the mould of someone who would be in the BBC. Plus, as you probably, well, you might know, you're a lot younger, South Asians weren't really the kind who went into journalism. One thing that I think the BBC noticed was they had a good response from what was already a fairly large South Asian community in the UK. So people did literally start asking, who's the brown guy? Would have South Asians come and say to me, I got into journalism because I was able to say to my folks, oh look, there's someone of our people, on there. So yes, people want to control the narrative and they will accordingly try to silence journalists. It was beaten into me at the BBC to be neutral. Right. The old school training of journalism in Britain was broadcasters don't editorialise. Like I say, it's not simply black and white. Yeah. Sometimes it's grey, because it's not always about one single thing. It can be so many elements. People do good things, people do bad things, and the same person does good and bad. Yeah. So I try to always keep an open mind.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of What's Brown Got to Do With It. So this episode has me both nervous and excited at the same time, because my guest today really needs no introduction, as he is usually the one introducing everyone himself. I am thrilled to introduce my esteemed guest, Riz Khan, and to say he's an internationally renowned journalist, author and public speaker is a bit of an understatement. With a remarkable career spanning the BBC, CNN and Al Jazeera, Riz Khan is a household name, renowned for his incisive interviews and insightful commentary on global affairs. He's hosted flagship TV interview shows, including groundbreaking programs on CNN and Al Jazeera English. Speaking to world leaders is just a normal day for him. Identified as the first mainstream BBC and CNN newscaster of South Asian origin, one of his shows was called One-on-One with Riz Khan, which is exactly what I want to do today. Thank you. Hello, welcome Riz. How are you?
Thanks, Shadi. Yeah, more steamed than esteemed today in the heat. But,
it's very hot. It is very hot. But I am so honoured that you agreed to be on this podcast, and really, really excited to share with the listeners about your journey into journalism. So as I mentioned in my introduction, you were actually the very first journalist on BBC of South Asian origin. Tell me, how did your journey start and how that has evolved for you over these years?
Thanks for having me on the show, Shadia. Well, first of all, I jokingly called myself the first brown guy when I discovered I was like the first of South Asian descent with the BBC and with CNN. What it was in those days, I think, I was getting into journalism in the mid-80s, 1980s. My background's medical, and I ended up doing journalism literally by accident as a postgraduate. And at that time, the BBC was very much the kind of BBC establishment, almost British civil service. So it was mostly the kind of, there was an upper middle class element to it. There was very Oxbridge and public school, as they say, privately educated people. And so I wasn't really typical of the mould of someone who would be in the BBC. Plus, as you probably, well, you might know, you're a lot younger, South Asians weren't really the kind who went into journalism, because it was always lawyer, doctor, father, So even me, my mother was happy I was going to be a doctor, I guess. But I did it as a way to get back into medicine, to raise some funds to pay for my clinical years at university. But at that time, BBC salaries were so bad in radio, which is where I started broadcast journalism, that I never saved up enough to go back. By which time, things started to move for me in terms of my career as a journalist. And, before I knew it, there was no really going back. That's partly what it was.
And how has that evolved for you over time? Because, you're the very first. And how did you see the growth of South Asians in that industry?
It started fairly quickly after I joined, because one thing that I think the BBC noticed was they had a good response from what was already a fairly large South Asian community in the UK. So people did literally start asking, who's the brown guy? Right. And as a result, they realized that representation of, South Asians and a more diverse community on TV and in radio, although in radio I sounded totally British to them. So I think that made them realize there was a need for growth within of a more diverse range of people. So they actually launched as they called it, Asian Afro-Caribbean training scheme to try to recruit more diverse people coming in. There was a specific program to get more people of color in. And I think the other thing is, and it was quite, an honor for me, something you probably will touch on, but I would have South Asians come and say to me, I got into journalism because I was able to say to my folks, oh, look, there's someone of our people, you know, on there.
Yeah.
So now the community in Britain is so diverse and integrated to a large degree that it's not a surprise. I mean, you know, there are probably more South Asians in the media
Absolutely.
than outside.
But there must have been like some kind of, when we're talking about parents wanting you to be, you know, a doctor or a lawyer, which was very, very typical. I remember my sister, when she told my dad she wanted to be a journalist. And he said, okay, do law first and then do whatever you want. And, you know, she never became the journalist that she wanted. But there was kind of a stereotype that, you know, you don't want to go into a field. The parents didn't encourage that. So how did that work out for you with your parents?
Well, so, I mean, I was brought up pretty much almost exclusively by my mother, who assumed I was just going to go back into medicine. And I think even when I started working at the BBC and started doing radio and stuff, and then TV, she still assumed I'd go back into medicine. And to a large degree, I did for many years. But then I think, and she would keep saying to me, you know, when are you going to go back into medicine? But then I think when her friends started to call her and say, is that your beta and your son on TV? I think she kind of said, was this a real job? And I said, well, it's all I'm doing at the moment is working. And, you know, things started to move quickly. And I think once I'd moved on into international journalism especially, I think she started to see it as something quite serious. And, you know, people noticed. I think that's what helped from her position. Plus, you know, I was paying the bills and everything was going well. So
as long as the bills are paid.
Yeah.
So when we do talk about like the evolvement of, or the evolving nature of South Asians in media, and it's not just in media, it's in all walks of life. You know, we have a lot of South Asian representation even in our cabinet, you know, our leaders. So one of my questions is that, I mean, there have been a lot of conversations around public figures such as Rishi Sunak, as I just mentioned, especially in regard to both positive and negative representations of the South Asian community. Now, how do you view media representation of South Asians and the identities many of us project to diverse audience perceptions?
It's changed massively. I would say probably up to the turn of the millennium, there was a more stereotypical representation of South Asians in films. You know, you had sort of South Asians played South Asian characters. They weren't considered, you know, mainstream. They would always be the little anomaly in the picture. And actually, it was interesting because I remember interviewing Nasruddin Shah, the Bollywood star, who was breaking into kind of Hollywood films as well. He was in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And I said, well, how was that? Because with Sean Connery and people like that. He said, well, I thought this is great. I'm getting into, you know, a Western Hollywood movie. And he said, and they made me play an Indian with a turban, Captain Nemo. So, you know, there has been that stereotype image for a long time. Now it's not the case. And you will see, I mean, woke culture, if you like, has its good side and its bad side. If there is something that is contemporary, you know, a drama, police thriller, whatever, and you see an Indian captain in the police force or something like that, you know, it's not in Britain, it's not unusual. It would happen. But if it's set in Victorian times and the head of the police unit is Indian, I'm thinking, come on, you know. Now, you might say, well, look, it's representation or whatever, but if you're sticking to true storytelling, then you can't say, you know, Downton Abbey is full of Indians. You know what I mean? So it's got its pros and its cons. But now I think South Asians are mainstream. And because South Asians sound and feel and are and relate to being British, I don't think there's anything wrong with the mix the way it is. And sometimes I feel Hollywood and TV in general in the West tries a bit too hard to mix people. But generally the representation is much better now.
Oh, it is. But how representative is the representation is my point.
In what way though? Because...
So, you know, like Rishi Sunak is our leader, for example, you know, how representative is his ideologies and his morals and ethics of, you know, a general or wider South Asian community?
Look, Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister of Britain, you know, the United Kingdom. And the issue is that he has to represent everyone. He doesn't have to be Indian just because he's Indian in that post. He has to relate to that post first and foremost. Where it could be encouraging or discouraging for South Asians is whether or not he recognizes that he's of Indian origin.
Right, yeah.
His policies don't have to be centered around South Asians. In fact, they shouldn't be. They should be centered around the needs of people as required. But I think that if, suddenly he's in denial about being South Asian, then there's a problem. And I think there are people in the UK who, rise up through ranks who suddenly feel, well, I'm white now. You know that expression,
Yeah.
coconut, brown on the outside,
Yeah.
white on the inside,
Yeah.
which people joked about when I first got into the media. They said,
Yeah.
you sound totally British,
Yeah.
so you're a coconut. And I was like, no, I think I'm probably, melted
Yeah.
bounty or whatever, mounds, mixed.
Which actually, back in the day, to use the term like coconut or anything like that is quite offensive.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a microaggression, but it's more widely used now in the woke culture. But I think back in the day, it wasn't allowed to be said. I feel like I had this incident at school where somebody mentioned coconut and there was a big investigation into it, and people took offense. And
I grew up in a different era, and to me, even terms like microaggression,
That never existed.
it makes me feel, what has gone wrong with this world? Oh, that was a microaggression. Did your lip curl at me? When I was growing up, of course, there was racism. I was lucky; I didn't experience too much of it,
Right.
because I was lucky enough to say, look, well, first of all, I sounded British and educated, and I think Britain's more about class structure than it is about colour. So people can relate far more to someone who sounds educated and British than they can to. I mean, if you had a Scottish guy with a heavy Indian accent, that's probably going to cause him more problems than anything else. Do you see what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So it's more about what a person represents in terms of their position in the still existing hierarchy of British society.
Interesting. That's a very good point, and I didn't think of it like that, but yeah, I think
I think that's what my experience was. Look, I
Yeah.
didn't experience too much direct racism because of my colour.
Yeah.
I might have been standing, waiting to be served a coffee in a coffee shop and thinking, oh, they're ignoring me because I'm brown. I didn't tend to think that way. I was also lucky I didn't experience any real violence. The skinhead culture in the 70s as I was growing up.
Yeah.
But by and large, I felt, lucky. Now, I have friends who had different experiences, and I was actually in a part of London, West London, where I grew up, where there was reasonable integration. There was, not too much trouble a lot of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when we talk about journalism now, in this day and age, and I want to specifically talk about, for example, India's crackdown on journalists and their freedom of speech. How do you think that impacts the morale and safety of South Asian journalists globally?
I don't think it's an issue specifically for South Asian journalists. I think the issue is for journalists in general.
Right.
I mean, we've seen more journalists killed in Gaza
Yeah.
in this conflict proportionally than pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah.
And now more specific targeting of journalists. That's been one of the biggest dangers, one of the biggest horrors about being a journalist in this day and age. The last couple of decades, maybe 3 decades, people have realized the power of the media in changing the narrative, and those involved in the conflict now target journalists as a way of trying to avoid their narrative being contradicted. So Russia has clamped down on journalists in Ukraine, and in Russia, of course. When the narrative is in danger of being upset, according to what that side wants, I think that's when journalists are most threatened. So, yes, people want to control the narrative, and they will accordingly try to silence journalists. Sometimes it's violence, shooting, direct targeting, as we have seen in Gaza. And in some cases, it's silencing through the courts, as we saw in some places like the Philippines and so on in the past. It depends very much on the regime.
Well, that's a great segue to actually one of my questions, and that is, there is, like you mentioned, there's a lot of there's a lot of things happening around the world right now with the war in Gaza, the, turmoil in Congo and Sudan and so on and so forth. So in your extensive coverage of global issues, such as conflicts and wars, how do you ensure that the framing of such stories is balanced and not influenced by dominant cultural narratives?
As a journalist, I'm old school. And I probably stick out a bit nowadays because I don't take positions. And I know some people like that, some people don't. If I'm interviewing someone from one side of a conflict or the other, and I'm letting them speak, Doesn't mean I'm not asking the right questions. It simply means I want to hear what they have to say. And I have a belief that the truth speaks for itself to some degree. When someone is pushing out and pumping a narrative that's obviously wrong by what people see out there, and social media backs that up a lot with what we see, I feel the truth filters through. So I'm a bit old school. I don't feel I have to control the narrative, in terms of a South Asian perspective or anything. It was beaten into me at the BBC to be neutral.
Right.
The old school training of journalism in Britain was broadcasters don't editorialize, and as a result we had to focus on not using adjectives, not giving our opinions. Journalists in those days didn't say I think, or in my opinion, or I feel. And I think that was actually a very important factor in training people to be neutral and discuss stories from a story and fact and figures perspective rather than commentary and opinion, which has taken over.
So how do you compete with something like, and I learnt of this recently, citizen journalism?
Well, so citizen journalism is an interesting force in that it brings out imagery and content that journalists often can't get because these people are on the ground, and we now all have incredible devices in our pockets, even, at the poorest level, if I want to put it that way. That means that the story can be out there. So it's a very valuable tool. But the difficulty is citizen journalists, also can use or take things from their perspective. And that can also then skew a story. The danger is that people who haven't necessarily been trained in how to read a story correctly might push out the wrong narrative. I'll give you a simple example. It's something I talk about a lot as an example, which was an advert, I think it was in 1984 or 1986 by the Guardian newspaper in Britain. And it was called Points of View.
Right.
And in Points of View, there's three scenes, or there's a scene with three angles on it. And the first angle shows a skinhead turning, spotting something and running away. And as he's running away, a car pulls out from behind, behind him. You think either that's undercover police and he's running from them, he's been spotted, or he's done something. Then you see from another angle him running towards an older gentleman with a briefcase and a hat, and it looks like he's attacking him. The guy turns around to defend himself. Totally different picture.
Yeah.
And then the third picture, which is the wide shot, shows the actual story, which is the skinhead is pushing the gentleman away from falling bricks from a collapsing scaffold. So he's actually saving him. Now, all your initial prejudices might be, he's a skinhead, he's gone to attack someone. First, he's done something wrong, he's running away. Second, he's attacking someone. Third, you realize, when you see the big picture, that he's actually saving someone. So it's very easy to misportray stories if you only see fragments. And the danger with people who aren't trained to be journalists is that they might often give a sliver or a segment or one piece of the jigsaw puzzle as the narrative, and it doesn't give the big picture.
Yeah, perception is relative, so that makes sense. So you've actually interviewed so many influential figures from across the world. When I was researching, I was just in awe, which is why I was so nervous about meeting you today. But who has had the most profound impact on you, and why?
Profound impact, I don't know. Look, I was lucky. I was also a journalist at a time when history was going through some very interesting phases in terms of the people out there.
Right.
It wasn't a circus like it is now with the whole Trump, Biden, Putin, whatever, Netanyahu circus, as I put it. It was more of a, politicians might have made good or bad decisions, but they had a status and a figure and a responsibility, whatever their position, to stand by that. So these figures, these aren't the best examples because at the time they were not necessarily liked or whatever. They might have been admired too, but Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, all these people had a particular role. And I was lucky enough to be there at a time when there was Nelson Mandela and Mikhail Gorbachev. And so I got to interview these people, the Dalai Lama. These are all key figures. So they have, in a way, they're part of my journalistic history. And I'm quite proud of that, to be able to spend time with these people. But sometimes it's small stories that can really resonate. Sometimes it's the surprise. People often ask me, do you give your questions in advance to people? And I don't. If someone wants to discuss topics and themes, yeah, that's fine. But the role was not to give questions, a list of questions to someone so that they can, you know, whatever. But I do want people to know the general direction. It helps, you know. But there was only one person I actually have to give questions to in advance, and actually 2 weeks in advance.
Oh, wow.
For a 10-minute interview. And my show was 25 minutes on tape, so 30-minute segment.
Yeah.
And people are trying to wonder, who is it? A politician, someone influential? Was it a royal? It was Stephen Hawking.
Oh, really?
And to get him to spend that much of his valuable time on this planet with his frozen body twitching his cheek to move the cursor on his computer so he could type out the answers that his voice computer would then speak in response to my questions, had to be specific as a result, was quite remarkable for me, that he would give me that time and that effort. I mean, how he wrote books, the books he wrote with this, you know, limitation, I have no clue. But there were some other people. I mean, look, I had my favorites, like Peter Gabriel. I was a big Genesis fan and his music. So for me, my producers looking at me, why has this interview been going 45 minutes? You know, normally I'm very good about timekeeping. If I need 25 minutes, I might record 30 and just trim bits and pieces. But essentially, I can get it down pretty sharp, you know. But I had to spend that time. I had a million questions for him.
I'm sure.
Now, fortunately, with TV not being linear in the sense that it's online, there's no specific 24 minutes 30 seconds where you have to trim. So it's much easier now in a way to tell the story and give it the time it's worth.
Amazing.
But he was, you know, these are the kind of figures I was lucky. So I don't know, in the way you phrase it, I don't know who would say the most profound effect.
Or was there anybody who just had, you know, a lasting impact on you, or changed the way that you thought about something, or
well, you know,
good or bad?
So it's not so. In terms of as a journalist, one of the biggest lessons I ever had was in local radio, where I was off to cover a court case, and in that court case, you know, the one I was covering was something else. I turned up at the court early. As journalists, we were told, do not turn up late. If you walk in late, a judge can hold you in contempt of court, and that can actually mean, at the judge's discretion. An undefined amount of time in jail. It's one of the few little quirks in British law that, you know, that contempt of court has almost no limits. The judge can do what they want. So we were always wary and scared. Do not fall asleep in court. Do not. And I happened to go in early, and I heard the case before the one I was supposed to be covering for the radio station. And it was a rape case, you know, of a young 16-year-old girl and 16-year-old boy. She accused him. He said it was consensual and so on. And listening to the evidence and stuff, I had in my head, this guy is guilty. You know, and when they declared him guilty, I thought, great, justice has been done. But then suddenly the girl burst out crying. The guy had been saying, no, it was consensual, and, you know, she's now lying about it being rape. She burst out in tears, realizing now she's going to lose him, because she had asked him to marry her. And he said, look, I'm not ready, I'm 16. So it was kind of almost revenge. And all the way I'd been led to have a certain belief, and then I realized afterwards, I had the wrong perception because I hadn't seen more than one angle on the story. I had let myself go down this particular path of believing everything from one side. Perhaps because I thought this was such a heinous crime, and for me, you know, I've always been very supportive of women's rights, and so for me this was terrible. And then later realizing the story wasn't quite what I thought was a big wake-up call for me as a journalist, and made me always realize I have to make sure I know all sides of the story, and always accept that there is not always a clear black and white. Sometimes there's a grey. And that, I think, guides me a lot in my journalism.
So how invested do you get in stories, or has there been a particular story that you...
It depends what you mean by invested, because for me, a story is a story. There's facts and figures, and my duty as a journalist is to tell that story using the tools around me, which means also the interviewees. And those people should then help to define the story through facts and figures. And then people can make up their minds on how they feel. Now, you know, a fact or figure could be that Donald Trump has achieved great things as a president, certain things, let's say. Some people may hate him, but you can't deny the fact if he's done something positive is a positive thing. Do you see what I'm saying? You know, so like I say, it's not simply black and white. Sometimes it's grey, because it's not always about one single thing. It can be so many elements.
Yeah.
People do good things, people do bad things, and the same person does good and bad.
Yeah.
So I try to always keep an open mind. So in terms of being invested in the story, I'm not coming at it with a predefined angle. I'm not coming at it with a, preemptive approach.
Do you have a favorite interview?
It's hard to say. I've done over 10,000 interviews.
Oh, wow.
Well over in my time. And that was having taken 10 years off to spend time with my daughter. So it was a lot of people.
Oh, wow.
Some of them really famous, some of them just news related, some of them repeats even, presidents and prime ministers. But I would say personal ones, like, someone like Peter Gabriel. I actually enjoyed interviewing Uri Geller, who's the paranormalist, spoonbender as they call him. And I actually got to know him quite well because I had a fascination from early childhood, early teens, in paranormal psychology. I was like, what is this about? What is it that certain human beings can do that others can't? And it can be sometimes very simple. In his case, he's got something there. I don't think he really knows what it is, but it's become a thing. But he's got something. Now, people try to debunk him and so on, that's fine. But that was fascinating for me, personally.
That kind of leading to my other last question with you. And what is your most significant contribution to journalism? And how do you mentor South Asian journalists to kind of navigate mainstream media complexities?
I think I'd like to think my contribution has been to show that irrespective of color, background, whatever, it's possible for a person to do a job. Now, I don't see myself as a hard journalist in the sense of I'm not, investigative. I've never really been keen to be what some call a parachute journalist. You jump into the big story whenever it happens. Some people are really hungry for that. It takes a toll, I think. My thing has always been storytelling. I've always liked the idea of being able to tell stories, perhaps to inspire through those stories. And I think that storytelling has been very important to me as a journalist. So I hope I contributed to the idea that almost anyone could. From a South Asian perspective, it was quite encouraging for me to have people come up and say, I got into this because I saw you. And it made me feel it's something we can do as South Asians. But, I would champion anyone who wants to really do what they want to do to pursue it, irrespective of background, color, whatever. But I do hope that, South Asian parents don't necessarily feel they have to limit their kids to certain professions. I understand, because it's a far less clear-cut profession than being a lawyer, being a doctor, being an engineer. These things define, I guess, financial stability, consistency. Journalism isn't like that. But then, in that way, journalism's the adventure. And I think that, for me, has been one of the best things, is that I've had an amazing adventure.
I think now, this new generation of parents, they're a bit different as well, because I think we talk about being a doctor and a lawyer, but actually, even being in those fields isn't as easy as it may have been.
It was never easy.
A while ago. It's very competitive now.
It was never easy. And that's why it defined for parents some success.
Right, yeah.
But you see now, there's the grey area. There's, I remember asking my daughter when she was about 6 or 7 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she's like, YouTuber. What if there's no YouTube when you're around? It's something totally different. So, I
think she had the right idea and the foresight. So one question, my last question that I ask all my guests, obviously the show is What's Brown Got to Do With It? And it's about, what does being brown mean to you? Is there a definition for you? Is there a feeling that comes with it?
Less sunburn. Though I have had sunburn, as I realized. I'm not so complacent anymore in the sun. I like my color. I really like my color. And I always found it strange on forms when they would ask, background, ethnicity. And in many cases, especially in the US, there was no South Asian. There was, white, black, Asian.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, wait, white, black, Asian. First, there are many shades of white.
Exactly.
Asian for Americans meant Chinese, East Asian, and Japanese and so on. And black meant someone of color. Now, there's many shades of black too. Yeah. So there was always a line that said other. Yeah. So I used to fill that in and write Herculean bronze. So being brown means being Herculean bronze.
And it's
Less Herculean
obviously
now.
worked to your advantage. I think you've had a tremendous career.
I think, actually, no. I think what has worked to my advantage is not worrying about being brown.
Yeah, I like that.
I think that's been the big thing for me.
Yeah.
I don't worry about being brown, and many people do.
Yeah.
I'm proud of who I am, what I am. And I don't judge people by their color.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Honestly, this has been such an honor and
It's my pleasure.
a privilege to just, speak to you and be in the same space and keep doing the amazing work that you're doing. I was watching so many of your interviews last night.
They're good for falling asleep, aren't they?
No, I did not fall asleep. I was actually thoroughly enjoying them. But thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Shadi.
being here today.
Yeah,
thank
thanks.
you.